Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are chapter links in the video timeline. I have tidbits. I want to talk about the Polka Jacket and what that was and what its relationship is to modern knitted sweaters and knitted jackets. And I want to talk a little bit about my next vintage project. So let's get started. So I have, I believe, 4 tidbits to talk about today. The first one has to do with Mrs. Wilson's knitting group. I've talked about this in the past. So in the United States, we have a National World War I museum that is located in Kansas City, Missouri. And they have been hosting these Mrs. Wilson's Knitting Circle lectures about once a month since May. And they've done it periodically in the past, like annually, for example, when people could actually come to the museum. But in this case, since people couldn't come to the museum, they were hosting lectures through Zoom, and then once the lecture is over, then they eventually post it to YouTube. So they've had a few already this summer. The next one is tomorrow. By the time you see this, it might be too late to do the RSVP, but they will put it on their YouTube channel later. So today or tomorrow, it's going to be Dr. Julia Irwin discussing the American Red Cross in World War I and its legacy on volunteerism. There was a link to the June program as well. So they have a YouTube channel. So I'll, in the links below, I'll link to their YouTube channel. So and I'll put the link to sign up for the RSVP. Again, I think by the time you see this, it will be too late. I just got the email letting me know about it earlier this week, so I couldn't tell you about it last week. But again, they put them on their YouTube channel. So I'll put that information down in the description. So the second thing I want to tell you about is an event called CocoVid that is put on by CozTube. So these were new phrases and terms for me. I've told you before that I subscribe to a channel called Bernadette Banner, and so she does recreations of Victorian clothing. And if it's something from the early Victorian era where there wouldn't have been machine sewing, she does it by hand. If it's from later, then she will use a hand cranked sewing machine from that time period. And so she shows how she goes about constructing these things and the techniques that she uses and things like that. And I have found it to be very interesting. So I've mentioned some of her videos once in a while. Well, what I noticed last weekend was that she had posted reminders for 4 different live streams that were all going to be happening this weekend. And I thought, why is she doing 4 live streams and why is she announcing it a week ahead? Like, I didn't know what was going on. So I clicked through just to see what it was about. And I saw that in the description, it says something about CocoVid, and it was talking about CozTube, and then there were some links for that. So CozTube is like the YouTube, it's like a group of YouTubers that do costuming. So they might do cosplay, or they might just like to do period, reconstructions or dress in vintage styles or historic styles or whatever. So they have Instagram and probably Facebook groups too. On their Instagram, they have links to all of the people who are part of the CozTube community. And so they have, in order to get included and have your YouTube channel be included in that, you have to post a certain number of videos per year about historic sewing or costuming or something like that. So they have some requirements about who gets included in there. And so Bernadette Banner is one of those people, and she's got a really big channel. So there are a lot of different things. Well, so that's what CozTube is. Well, apparently this weekend would have been the annual conference, this annual conference called Costume College. And I don't even know where that takes place, if it's in England or if it's here in the US or if it's in multiple places. I don't know. But this would have been the weekend. And so there would have been all kinds of little events like fashion show probably, but as well as different classes that you could have taken in person. and they couldn't do that this year. So people in the CosTube community decided to get together and create CoCovid, which is costume during COVID. It's not put on by the costume college people. It's done by this CosTube community. So I went and I looked at what all of it was, and a lot of it is sort of interesting to me just to see that this is people who make things that are clothing and textile related that are historic, and I'm looking at vintage knitting, and so that's interesting to me. I don't want to sew these things, but I was looking through there and I saw one of the names of the presenters or video channels was Engineering Knits. And I was like, oh, and so there were going to be a few things about knitting. And so I went and I looked at her channel. So she's into both the sewing aspect, but also the knitting aspect. But I found out more about this whole CoCovid thing. And I thought that was really interesting. So some of you may already know about this, or you might just be interested in seeing those. And so I'm going to leave the link down below to this CosTube Instagram. It's actually not an Instagram page. It's called Linktree. So it's a link to all of the ways to find out like the program schedule, as well as they have this thing called a Discord server, which is where it's like online forums, like you can chat groups, I guess, and that's going to be up for a while. I don't know when they're going to close the Discord server down. I've never used Discord. I've heard of it, but I've never used it. So I'm going to leave links to that so you can see what the schedule is and see what all the different things is. So far I did watch the very first like live stream that was for the whole event, and that was Bernadette Banner and a woman named Kathy Hayes. So Bernadette was moderating this and asking questions and responding to what Kathy Hay was presenting, which was a lecture on the House of Worth, which was the first really haute couture house of design ever. And it started in the middle of the 19th century. And so she tells the story about, I think his name is Charles Worth, and how he happened to go to Paris and his life events that caused him to end up becoming this designer. And so it was really interesting. That was just kind of from a historical standpoint, just to have that kind of background of understanding about how fashion sort of evolved into how it functions today and what seems very familiar to us. And then I watched a video about five different hand stitches because I'm just curious as a knitter. When I look at vintage patterns, they assume really that you're going to be using the same sorts of sewing stitches that you would have used in woven cloth. So things like mattress stitch came like probably mid or later part of the 20th century. It wasn't something that was used in the 19th century or earlier 20th century. So I was curious to watch these particular stitches and see if they were done differently than I knew how they were done. Because when I was an early knitter, I did tend to use those types of stitches because those were the ones I knew about, like back stitch and whip stitch or overcast stitch. So, and I'm noticing in these vintage patterns, a lot of times they'll say, and seam using over and over, which I think means overcast stitch, where other times they'll talk about back stitch. So it was just, I wanted to make sure that the way I learned these stitches from some book when I was a kid is actually the correct way to do things. So I was watching that video. So there's some more that I want to be watching this weekend, and Engineering Knits has a couple of them that I will be watching as well. The third little tidbit I have is that there was a discussion on Twitter amongst various knitters. I'm not sure where it came from. I don't know if it was it was a sub discussion that came out of something that I tweeted originally. I think it may have. And then there was this other discussion that came up, and that was about different words for purling in other languages. And I had noticed, because once in a while I'll find a pattern that's only available in a foreign language. And so I have some tools that I use in order to help me translate that. So one of the nice things about European patterns is that they are written so tersely that there isn't that much to translate. But once you've learned what the certain abbreviations are and how they are laying out their patterns, it becomes much easier to identify what's going on in different places. Because of that discussion about purling, I went on to one of these online dictionaries or glossaries. There's one that a yarn company called Drops has, that it has a glossary of, I don't know how many different languages, 12, 15, something like that, different languages. And so you can say what language you want to compare to what other language. So if you are speaking English and you want to know what the Swedish terms are, or if you're Dutch and you want to know what the French terms are, you can have the two charts line up so you can find your word and then find out what the word is in that other language. And then there's another glossary that before I ever heard about the Drops one, that I had found through a blog called, I think it's String or Nothing. I always think it's called Sticks and String, but it's String or Nothing. And she has a really nice international glossary too. It's just different kind of format and sometimes different words, or maybe there might be different languages in each of those. But those are really, really handy tools to have. And I was thinking about this a little bit more because there's often questions that come up in Ravelry about, well, I found this pattern, but it's only in German or it's only in Finnish. And can somebody translate this for me? And the answer is always no. Nobody can translate it for you. First of all, only the person who, even though the pattern is free, that doesn't mean A, that it's in the public domain, and B, doesn't mean that anybody somewhere can translate it and then redistribute it in the translated version. Only the original author has the right to say it can be translated. If you wanted to translate it, like if you knew how to translate it and you wanted to tell the author, hey, I'd be happy to translate this for you, would you like that? And then you could include this on your pattern page. You could do that. But if you are somebody who doesn't speak that language and you just want to have it translated, you don't even really have the right to have that done. At least in some countries. But what you can do is translate it for yourself. And then if you get stuck, you can ask for help with certain phrases. These online dictionaries and glossaries can be really helpful. And then if you have actual sentences of information that you need to translate that aren't just like abbreviations and numbers, then you can use Google Translate. And that can do a pretty good job. It can kind of mangle things because sometimes words are used in knitting that mean something different in the context of knitting than it means in a different context. That's when you're like, I'm not sure what this means, and then you can go to the group in Ravelry that's called Excuse Me, and you can say, here's what I'm trying to do, and this is the sentence that I'm having trouble with, and I think it means this, or this is what this is how far I got. Can someone help me with that? And then somebody can fill that in for you. So that can be really handy. So the fourth thing is, I've been doing a lot of research on 19th century knitting patterns in the past couple of weeks because I've been wanting to understand more about the modern day sweater, which really sort of came to surface in the end of the 19th century as an athletic garment. And trying to really trace, where the various roots of these sweaters are, like the construction methods, the early construction methods, like where did those come from? Because they were actually end up being a lot more different construction methods in the 1890s than I had anticipated. And so I started looking further and further back in the 19th century in these different books to try to see what other kind of upper body garments were there. One of the garments that I found was called a bosom friend. And I read the instructions, and I wish I could remember what book it came from. I didn't make note of it. I just read what it was and went and kind of thought, well, that's not really what I was looking for. And I didn't make note of what the book was. But the instructions were basically to cast on, some number of stitches and just knit plain, meaning just every row knit, which would be garter stitch, and then bind off. And then, so you're basically just knitting a rectangle. And then at each edge, you're supposed to pick up 12 stitches. And then you're supposed to knit the shoulder straps until they were the required length. And I was reading this and I thought, well, how do I know what the required length is? I don't even know how this is supposed to go together. You have a square and then you have straps, 2 straps of indeterminate length, and what are they attaching to? And one of the other things I had found at one point was something called a habit shirt, which was basically, it was a more finished item, but it basically was kind of a front and maybe part of a back. So it was like there was a front and a partial back that came back, and then there were straps or ribbons on there, and then you were supposed to tie it around to the front. So a habit shirt refers to a writing habit. And so women's writing habits were designed very much like menswear, so very tailored and very tight fitting. And so women had these things called habit shirts, which was basically just a blouse front. There might have been short sleeves, but the idea was it just have the front to it so that you didn't have something stuffed into these tight sleeves as well. So this knitted habit shirt was something that wasn't meant to be seen other than maybe just peeking out, and was something to be warmer. Or maybe it was just that it wasn't a full garment, and so they called it a habit shirt. It wasn't really clear what that was supposed to how and when it was supposed to be worn. Like if you were going on a carriage ride and you just needed an extra layer, or are you wearing that? I don't know. But this bosom friend was like the most simple version of something like that. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And I think it was, I don't know if it was on Twitter or if it was in the All Things Vintage group, that somebody linked an article about what a bosom friend was. And it turns out it was something in the early 19th century. So the Regency period, this is the Regency period, like the Jane Austen era, where the dresses, were kind of fitted right underneath the bust, and then there was just flowing. So things are really, really loose. And so bosom friend could be something to keep you warm, or it could be like a bust accentuator. So you would wear it underneath your dress. So I think it really did have these shoulder straps that then maybe tied around the front in some way. I don't know. But I thought that was an interesting garment. So I mentioned in Tidbits that I came across this YouTube channel called Engineering Knits, and that she is interested in both sewing and knitting, like 19th century stuff. So she is making this entire outfit from 1892. It's an entire outfit, including the stockings, the underwear, which is a combination underwear, which is like a onesie type of underwear with the open crotch because you couldn't take your clothes off to go to the bathroom back then. You had to have a slit in your drawers so that you could sit down and go to the bathroom. So she made the combination, and she's made like a corset cover. I don't know if she made her own corset or not, or if she just bought something like that. And then she made this whole other outfit. It's like a winter walking outfit. So as I was looking through these 19th century books, looking for examples of actual sweaters and then sort of the ancestors of sweaters, I found her channel. I thought, well, 1892, the knitting book that she's getting her knitting, her stockings and her combination and all of these other items that she's knitting are from the same knitting book where I found the earliest sweater pattern that I could find that was actually called a sweater. Now that was an American term. And I say sweater like this because even in the United States at that time, when the word sweater was used, they almost always had quotation marks around it. And I think it's because there were different uses for the term sweater that were in somewhat times related and sometimes not. And every time I've encountered that word, like in the newspapers during that time frame, they always had the quotation marks around it, and oftentimes they would then define what sweater meant in terms of their article. For example, I found an article that just thrilled me to pieces because it was written by my childhood hero or heroine, Nellie Bly. who was a newspaper reporter back in a time period where women weren't really newspaper reporters. Even if they were working at a newspaper as a writer, they were relegated to the women's pages or the society pages or something like that. But she would go out and do basically investigative reporting and find out about like terrible working conditions or terrible conditions for patients in mental hospitals by posing as somebody who couldn't communicate or seemed a little off, and then she'd get put in this mental institution and stay there for 4 days, and then she'd call her editor, and then they'd get her out, and then she'd write an expose on the conditions. So this article that I found that she had written she was talking to an athlete. And I think maybe he was a well-known athlete of the time. I didn't really look any more into him. I was really focused on the sweater. But she was visiting him, and he was showing her his daily routine of what he did all day long. And he was getting in shape. I think it was like some kind of athletic event. I don't know if he was boxing or what he was doing. But one of the things that he would do was put on a sweater, and then he would go out for a run or do his calisthenics or whatever. And so she described what the sweater was, and it was a knitted shirt. It was a sweater like we would think of a sweater, but with the intent of making him sweat. So that was another use or another meaning of the word sweater in this country at that time, was something that you would wrap around your body that would cause you to sweat. So I remember finding an article, a little news clip a year or so ago about how you could lose 10 pounds in 1 week, and you would wrap like 3 or 4 flannel sweaters around your body, making sure not to have them covering certain parts of your body. But then you go out and do some vigorous horseback riding, and you are guaranteed to lose 10 pounds per week. So sweater had those two kind of overlapping meanings. It was something that that could be made of any kind of material. It might be wool, flannel, or something like that. But the intention was just to make you sweat, and usually while exercising. And then this idea of a sweater that you wore while you were exercising that would move with you became attributed to the knitted garments. So there's a third term for sweater, and previously I'd only seen it in newspapers in the UK. And that in that case, a sweater referred to someone who ran a sweatshop. So they were contracting like textile work usually, and then they were, working their seamstresses and tailors or whatever, hard, and who were probably working piecework and not getting paid very much. So the person who was in charge of the sweatshop was called the sweater. And I did also find an article in like the 1880s or 90s that was on the west coast of the US that referred to and had sweater in quotes again as somebody who was running a sweatshop. So there are these overlapping meanings. I know it's just interesting to me that they always put it in quotations, and then they often also defined what that meant. So as I was looking through these 19th century pattern books, and knowing that the original athletic sweaters were made from like wool jersey knitted fabric that was used to make underwear, I thought, well, maybe there were underwear patterns from the 1900s that were very similar to the sweater patterns. And I was able to find a jersey for a boy or girl in like 1885. And I found ladies' underwear vests and things like that in the 1880s and 1870s. And I was looking at how those were constructed. So when I found Engineering Knits, I contacted her and I said, I have that same 1892 book, and there's a sweater in there, and here are the other things I found. Have you found anything earlier than that? That's like knitted upper body garments? Because I'm just really trying to see how far back these patterns go. Well, she sent me an email back and said, oh, well, there's this pattern for a polka jacket from 1847. And I went and I looked at it, and it was like, I was astounded actually to see this because it was not underwear. It was definitely something that was meant to be worn out in public. It wasn't something to be worn, you know, when you're golfing out in public, and it wasn't something to be worn just to keep warm inside the house that would be casual and you wouldn't go out in public. And it was meant to be worn out in public. We had some back and forth on this for a while, that we were finding things. Sometimes we'd both find the same thing in the same day. And, oh, I found this. And I kept wondering, why was this thing called a polka jacket? Like, what did that even mean? And sometimes I call it a Polish pelisse, and sometimes I called it a polka jacket. And so I started, you know, looking up what these terms were. So it turns out that the polka, the dance, the polka, just swept through Europe in like the 1830s and 40s. People were crazy about it. Like that was the dance they wanted to do, and they started giving polka the label polka to everything, including polka dots. So we all know what polka dots are. The first instance of polka dot being in print is from a 1857. The May 1857 issue of Gaugain's Ladies' Book, I think it was the name of it. And it was describing this summer scarf that had embroidered polka dots along the edge. That's 1857. But the polka jacket probably dates to the early 1840s. And it was also called a Polish pelisse. So the pelisse was a fur-lined jacket. That's where the word pelisse comes from. And the Polish part of it apparently refers to like military wear, like military inspired jackets and clothing was really common. And there were these soldiers called the hussars, that supposedly wore these pelisse over, it was like a jacket, a fur-lined jacket that they would wear over one shoulder to supposedly protect them from getting cut by swords. So that was something that was worn over one shoulder, and it was fur-lined. And then that got adopted into this pelisse jacket, a fur-lined jacket that women would wear. And so then this Polish pelisse had ermine, so it could be like silk or whatever. The main jacket might have been silk or some other kind of fabric, and then it would be trimmed with ermine. And I didn't know what ermine was either. Ermine has this connection to royalty. So if you saw Hamilton, you saw King George coming out and he had this cape and had the white fur with the black spots, that's meant to look like ermine. So that's what a Polish pelisse is. And I found a picture of one of like a real Polish pelisse polka jacket in this book about fashions. And it was a drawing from the 1844, I believe. Knitted versions of them were very common. And the way that they would simulate that ermine trim is they would just have that be in white yarn. And then you would take little tufts of black yarn and attach them at different points. So we were talking about this whole thing with the polka jacket in the All Things Vintage group, and someone said, I wonder if that's where polka dot came from, just like the dots of black on the white ermine, and that's like polka, became polka dot. We don't know. If you look up the history of polka dot, the etymology of it, it's just all they know is that polka was very popular in the mid-19th century, and for whatever reason, they were calling this dotted fabric polka dots. In this discussion in the All Things Vintage group, somebody mentioned that there was an article about the polka jacket in Piecework magazine in January, February of 2013. So they have this polka jacket in there, and they talk about the history of the entire polka jacket, and they have a pattern from that era that they have been updated, and they've got schematics for in multiple sizes and current contemporary yarns and all of that. So far, to me, that seems like the earliest sort of actual relative of a sweater that I have seen so far. So I've selected my next vintage pattern. It's a pattern from 1895, 6, 7, somewhere around there. I'll put a link down to, because it's in the public domain, and it's a pattern I've gotten off archive. It's in 2 different publications. I found it first in the Delineator, that women's magazine, but then the Delineator was published by Butterick, and so and the Delineator was really a way for Butterick to sell patterns, sewing patterns and knitting patterns. So they would sometimes compile those patterns all into a book. So there's this 1897 book of knitting patterns that has women's sweater patterns, kids patterns, men's patterns, a bunch of them. So one of the ones in there is this sweater for a boy of 10 to 12 years. In some respects, it's going to be really boring to knit because it's knit one, purl one, ribbing for the entire thing. But the construction method is something I've never seen before. And I want to understand how it works and if it works, because I keep thinking, how is this going to work? Is this really going to work? It's cast on at the bottom. It's knit in the round and knit one, purl one, ribbing up to the armholes. So just a big tube of knit one, purl one, ribbing up to the armholes. Then you divide the 2 halves, one for the front and one for the back. And you knit, they tell you very specific number of rows that you're supposed to knit. They never tell you what that measurement is supposed to be. They don't tell you a lot of things. So you knit, you knit the length of the armhole, and then when you get to the top of the shoulders, you join in the round again, which I'm like, what? And then they talk about the seam line. So in the vintage patterns, a purl would have been a seam stitch. And so there would be a column of purls at each side here. And so that is the seam line. And so I think it's every 3rd round, you're supposed to do a decrease on either side of the seam line. So you're doing 4 decreases every 3 rows until you get back down. I think you start at 192 stitches until you get down to 120. So you're reducing 72 stitches, but that's as many rounds as the armhole is deep. Like that is just, the whole thing just like seemed weird to me. Like what is going on here? So you're decreasing along here and just keep decreasing forever until you're down this 129 or 120 stitches. And then you switch to the striping pattern that's going to become the fold over for the turtleneck. So after you've done all of this, then you are picking up stitches for the sleeve. And they only have you pick up like 12 stitches on each side of the seam. So they're having you pick up 24 stitches at the top of the armhole. And you knit across them, you pick up 1 more stitch. Then you knit across them, you pick up another stitch. Back and forth, increasing 1 each time as you go around. Until you pick up 1 stitch for every row when you're doing this. And then the last thing you do is you're actually picking up across 32 stitches all the way across here. So I think that's something like 25% of the total number of stitches that you want is what you pick up at the end. So you're picking up 20% at the beginning and 25% at the end, and the in-between part, you're doing that. So there's a lot going on there, and I was trying to figure out how all of this is actually going to work. And what I realized is that because you don't have like a straightaway bind-off part under the underarms, but you are picking up in a straight path under there in the armhole, all of that is going to change how the fabric sits on the body. So you have something that is big enough to go around the body here, but when it hits the arm, it's coming out forward this way, and it's coming off the shoulder too. So the sweater just kind of goes like that at the shoulders. So I think the fact that you're decreasing all of these going up the neck, you're decreasing from this point. So you're creating this kind of funnel that's from down here, and you're creating this kind of a turn for the sleeve with the way the sleeve cap is formed. It's really interesting, and I have a hard time believing it's going to work. I'm just so fascinated by it. So I'm doing some experiments right now. I'm doing some swatching, and I'm trying to figure out gauges and what is going to happen with the construction. I don't fully understand how firm the fabric was supposed to be back then. It seems like they were working things much more firmly than we do today, but I don't know what the quality of the yarn that was called for, if it was an airier, loftier yarn that was easier to compress than the yarn that I would normally use today to knit a sweater. I don't know. So I'm going to have to do some, figuring out what size I want this sweater to be, and then see, what gauge I want to work this yarn at, and then see, will these calculations work? Like how does this calculation work, and how does this shaping of this upper body that is so different from anything that I've seen before, just, see how it all works out. So that is going to be my next vintage project, and I will be updating you on it the more that I learn going forward. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.